Welcome to this week's episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is Carlene Johnson. So when Governor Bob Ferguson entered this legislative session, he said that taxes were going to be a last resort to deal with the budget shortfall. And yet, just yesterday, he signed the largest tax increase in Washington state history. Carlene, tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, $78 billion operating budget passed by majority Democrats with no Republicans in support. And then, as you mentioned, signed into law on Tuesday by Governor Ferguson at a 3:00 bill signing. So literally the final hours on the final day possible to sign the budget bills. We saw that two-year operating budget get shoved through, and it is about $9+ billion in brand new taxes. So we didn't take away any taxes, and we added a whole pile of new things on everything you could imagine, from business taxes to sales taxes to licensing fees. I mean, there really doesn't seem to be an unscathed sector of public life for the rest of us that won't, hit our pocketbooks.
Yeah. And so Governor Ferguson held out until the last day, as you mentioned, and there was a lot of speculation about whether or not he would call a special session and not sign the budget and say, hey, you got to go in and do some spending cuts. What was effectively what they're saying with this budget is, and with these tax increases, is that they were a last resort, meaning there was nothing to cut from the budget. But with all this due spending, there was nothing to cut in any significance.
Well, in fairness to the governor, he did request state agencies and got state agencies to make some significant cuts, whether that's to payroll or just finding efficiencies, redundancies. Shared a couple of the agencies came back with proposals, say, okay, your accounting guy can work for my accounting guy. We can, do the same thing for one another. And so there were some efficiencies, and there were a few $1 billion in cuts or programs that were expected to expand that he held off and said, I'm not going to. So they consider that a cut, right? So they're supposed to.
And that's the problem is right. When people talk about spending cuts, there's two things. One, when you propose to spend $16 billion and you end up only increase spending by $8 billion, saying $8 billion in cuts is in cuts of proposed increased spending. And the other thing is good for context is how they got to this point where there's a budget shortfall. And it's because the spending increases that they've done and have proposed have outpaced revenue increases still at record levels. So they're spending so much more money that the revenue streams are not keeping up. And they're saying by not increased spending that they're cutting spending. Now, if they'd cut spending to match the amount of revenue that they're expected to have, that would be spending cuts. But even then, it's somebody who's spending more money than they bring in as part of their paycheck, and then they cut that spending to where it's now they have a balanced checkbook. You're not really cutting spending. You're cutting spending that you can't afford.
Well, and that is the argument that minority Republicans, especially Senate Republicans, Senator Chris Gildon and Senator Nikki Torres, who crafted a no new taxes balanced budget that still funded all critical services and programs without a single increase in taxes. We didn't get very far with that one, but you mentioned the budget shortfall. That's a huge still point of controversy because the figure that Democrats kept throwing out there got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they ended up saying, oh my goodness, the sky's falling. It's a $16 billion budget shortfall. Well, nonpartisan staff to the Senate Ways and Means Committee came back and said, no, it is absolutely $7.5 billion. And that is an adjusted figure based on the most current revenue projections of, money coming into the state.
Yeah,
less than half of what the figure was that was touted by the governor.
And then it's interesting how inflating the budget shortfall has worked rhetorically in justifying new taxes, but it without saying, hey, how did you guys, the people in charge, arrange your budget and write a budget so that you have this massive shortfall. And the other thing that's worthy of noting is that this shortfall occurred at a time, and we've talked about this before in the past. This is occurring at a time when Washington State is bringing in more money and trying for tax revenue than ever before.
Record revenue.
While having financial problems where they're resorting to new taxes. What happens when they come into a session and they've got a massive shortfall, and that's not due just to increased spending, but because revenue has actually gone down? You know, you have something that goes bad in the stock market, the capital gains income tax doesn't bring in the revenue that they're expecting, or God forbid, there's a housing crash and property taxes go down, or there's a recession and not only is property taxes going down because house values have gone down, but then people are spending less, so that means less sales tax. Our state is very dependent on its sales tax, and then they go in, and so they have reduced revenue that's driving this budget deficit, and they've already used the tax increases to plug this budget shortfall. What are they going to do at that point?
Well, and the governor was even asked about that yesterday. I mean, he conceded that he's not expecting a good outlook when they get the latest revenue projections. One comes out next month in June, and then another one will come in September. He said, I don't expect it to look good. But that was part of why he suggested we need to do this now and need to shore up these critical services and programs. And he kept saying core functions of government. Well, yeah, it's a big pile. And then he said, we don't know what's coming from the Trump administration, right? He kept saying we could lose K through 12 funding. We could lose Medicaid funding from the Trump administration. So we have to shore these things up now and take in all this tax revenue here because we're not sure what's coming from the Trump administration. But it's worth noting that every other state is dealing with the same potential cuts from the federal government, right? And yet we're the only state, according to the Tax Foundation, that is, passing these massive tax increases and blaming the Trump administration. Other states are going, well, we better rein in, this right now and protect our taxpayers.
And it's interesting for them to say that they're worried about losing federal funding, and yet they're also suing the Trump administration over, the amount of lawsuits that have been filed. And I know the governor and the legislature aren't involved in that, but you think that the rhetoric would be, hey, we're going to be very careful with the battles that we pick because we need funding. Because if the federal government did cut funding for the state and you have a recession and you have all these tax revenues drop, you can pass tax increases to deal with that, but that will cause people to leave the state, exit the state, especially people who are the wealthy ones who do pay. People can talk about the proportion that they pay, but the reality is that it's the wealthy who pay the sales tax when they buy a yacht or some fancy, luxury, be it. They're the ones who pay the property taxes when they've got a house that's worth $4 million. They're the ones who pay taxes through the business and occupation.
And they're the ones that create the jobs for Washingtonians.
And so they can pick up and leave. But more importantly, they're the ones who run the companies that can then say, you know what, we're going to pack up and leave and go to a state where we have some sort of stability long term in terms of our tax structure. And they're going to be looking at states that are responding to the same situation by cutting taxes or getting rid of their income tax. So it's interesting to see how Washington State is going really against the flow of many other states nationwide and charting its own course. And so it remains to be seen whether or not they're going to end up at a peaceful shoal or going through the perfect storm. So
in our final couple of minutes, we have to talk about one of the other bills that was signed on Tuesday, and the photobomb, the whatever you want to call it. You know which one I'm talking about, the passage of HB 1296, which gutted the Parents' Bill of Rights. That was one of the bills signed on Tuesday morning. And you want to set the stage because you were watching it alongside me.
It has probably got to be one of the, I don't know if the word trolling would be the right way to describe it.
Yeah.
But think about, I don't know how to set the stage other than saying the last person I expected to see walk through that door for the signing was Tim Eyman, who's been an initiative sponsor, has testified on a lot of bills. he and when Bob Ferguson was the attorney general, they had a running spat for years. And
how many times did he sue Ayman?
Enough to where he's significantly financially crippled Ayman, and Ayman is not only standing in the room, he's standing directly behind Governor Ferguson, who finally realizes that he's there and turns around and sees this guy who he spent much of his tenure as attorney general pursuing or prosecuted, I would say.
It was a brilliant moment to be sitting in that room and watch Ayman stroll in and stand, as you mentioned, directly behind the governor. And for the governor's body language to completely change as he turns around behind him and is like, oh my gosh, that guy's here. And you actually could hear the exchange. I know you heard it. The microphone's hot, so you can hear the exchange where Ferguson's like, are you really gonna? And Ayman just says, I'm just here in respectful opposition. It was beautiful just to kind of see that awkward moment. I think that Ferguson was like wondering, oh my gosh, is he going to sabotage this whole event? And he didn't. He just stood there and didn't really even have a lot of emotion on his face.
I think that was the funny thing is he just stood there, didn't say anything. And you can see the look on all the lawmakers around him when they realize he's in the room.
Well, this was HB 1296, as we've talked about on Washington in Focus, was the most divisive, hotly debated, tears in public hearings piece of legislation gutting the Parents' Bill of Rights of any bill throughout the session. And Ayman was there. In every hearing that I attended, he was there, either signed in to testify, not getting a chance to, or getting his 30 or 60 seconds to speak against the legislation, which we should add for folks watching that Let's Go Washington, the group that brought Initiative 2081 to create the Parents' Bill of Rights, has already, got an initiative filed, and I'm told will any day begin a massive signature gathering campaign. I heard some rumors on Tuesday night, TJ, that the goal is to get 1 million people to sign, to send a message once and for all to lawmakers not to try and do this again.
Yeah. We'll obviously be keeping an eye on that. And if they achieve that goal, that will be really remarkable.
That would be remarkable.
So thanks, Growing. Listeners can keep up with this story and others at thecentersquare.com. I'm TJ Martinelli, your host. Thanks for listening to Washington in Focus.